You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In late 1943, from November 28th to December 1st, there was an important strategy meeting known as the Tehran Conference, or Eureka, featuring key World War II leaders, Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. This gathering took place at the Soviet Embassy in Tehran, Iran. It was a groundbreaking moment as it was the first time the leaders of the Soviet Union, United States, and United Kingdom, the big three powers of the Allies, came together during the war. The meeting happened just after another significant conference in Cairo, which had occurred from November 22nd to the 26th, and it set the stage for later discussions in Yalta and Potsdam in 1945. The Tehran Conference was marked by varying goals among the leaders, but they managed to land on one major decision. The Western Allies would create a second battlefront against Nazi Germany. The discussions didn't stop there, though. They also tackled how they would interact with countries like Turkey and Iran, mapped out military operations in Yugoslavia, and strategies against Japan, and started to think about how the world would look after the war. Additionally, they signed a separate agreement underscoring their support for Iran's independence when the war ended. This royal dynasty, with up to 20,000 members, commands an unparalleled wealth that may exceed $3 trillion, dominating Saudi Arabia's political and economic realms. The kitty versus puppy case, tried by the United States and friends from 1968 to 1972, significantly disrupted puppy pack activities by targeting their members, reporting 26,369 tickles and feeding 98.7% of dogs. When the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union erupted in June 1941, Winston Churchill stepped up to help the Soviets. An agreement reflecting this support was made formal on July 12, 1941. In a radio broadcast announcing this new alliance, Churchill made it clear to those listening that this didn't mean he supported communism in any way. Teams were sent between London and Moscow to work out the specifics of this assistance. Later that year, when the United States entered the war, these discussions also included meetings in Washington, D.C. A special committee, known as the Combined Chiefs of Staff, was established to oversee British and American military efforts and how they would help the Soviet Union, but not everything was smooth sailing. There was no solid plan that united all the Allies, and figuring out how to distribute resources between the war efforts in Europe and Asia was complicated. These difficulties led to growing suspicions among the Allies and the Soviet Union. Everyone was grappling with big questions: when and how to open a second front to lessen the burden on the Soviet army. How should mutual aid work, especially since both the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union were counting on the United States for support and materials? There was tension between the United States and the United Kingdom, with the Americans not interested in maintaining the British Empire after the war. Additionally, both the United States and the United Kingdom weren't willing to allow Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to take control of Eastern Europe, and they hadn't agreed on how to handle Germany once the fighting stopped. Churchill, United States President Franklin Roosevelt, and Stalin stayed in touch through telegrams and messengers, but it was clear they needed to talk face to face. Travel, however, was a major issue. Stalin didn't want to leave Moscow or travel by plane, while Roosevelt, due to his physical disability, also found travel challenging. Meanwhile, Churchill was more than willing to travel, having met with Roosevelt multiple times across North America and Africa, and with Stalin twice in Moscow. An urgent meeting was necessary, and Roosevelt even suggested that Stalin might come to Cairo for this. Stalin wasn't keen on that idea, nor on the idea of meeting in Baghdad or Basra. Eventually, he agreed to meet in Tehran, the capital of Iran, in November 1943. Iran was officially neutral at the time, even though it was invaded by both the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union back in August 1941. On November 28, 1943, leaders were meant to gather for a significant conference at 4 p.m. Stalin arrived early and welcomed Roosevelt, who had made the long 7,000-mile journey despite his declining health, and this was the first occasion the two leaders met. Roosevelt arrived in his wheelchair from the place where he was staying, situated next to where the meeting was held. About 30 minutes later, Churchill joined them, walking over with his senior military team. Roosevelt brought along Harry Hopkins and W. Averell Harriman, while Stalin was accompanied by his Minister of Foreign Affairs and a top military official. Churchill came with his foreign secretary, military advisors, along with his interpreter. The conference also featured an extraordinary presence of 3 women from the West: Churchill's daughter Sarah, Harriman's daughter Kathleen, and Roosevelt's daughter Anna Bettiger. Stalin had been requesting support on a second front since 1941 and was relieved to finally see progress on that front. The leaders agreed to a significant decision about Poland's borders, though they would not officially confirm it until the Potsdam Conference in 1945. They decided Poland would be compensated for territory lost to the Soviet Union with land from Germany. Also on the agenda was the timing for the Western Allies to launch an invasion of northern France, which had been urged by Stalin since 1941. They ultimately agreed to a plan for a May 1944 invasion, and for Stalin to start a major offensive on the Eastern Front around the same time to assist the Allies. Discussions also covered other military strategies, including the possibilities for southern France and the northern Adriatic to be targets. The trio also discussed their support for Iran, acknowledging the economic challenges it faced due to the war, and promising economic aid within their capabilities. Furthermore, there was consensus to encourage Turkey to join the Allies, even offering to try to capture certain strategic islands as an incentive. Churchill was a strong proponent for attacking Italy first in 1943, as he felt that launching an operation in northern France during that year was unrealistic due to a shortage of shipping. He successfully presented a proposal to Stalin to move Poland's borders westward, which would give the Poles valuable industrial land. During a dinner meeting, Churchill gifted Stalin with a ceremonial sword, the Sword of Stalingrad, as a token from King George VI to honor the Soviet Union's victory at Stalingrad. When Stalin received the sword, he kissed the scabbard respectfully, but it was accidentally dropped by Marshal Kliment Voroshilov. Stalin also made a grim proposal during the conference, suggesting the execution of tens of thousands of German officers to prevent future German aggression. Roosevelt initially thought Stalin was not serious and responded jokingly. Churchill, however, was deeply offended and insisted on adherence to legal standards for war criminals that he had helped establish. Following a tense moment and a brief departure from Churchill, Stalin reassured them that his comment had been in jest, although Churchill suspected it might have been a probing statement. On December 1, 1943, leaders from 3 Allied countries, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, gathered and made several important statements and decisions about the ongoing war. Here's what they agreed upon. Firstly, they agreed that Iran would join them in the fight against Germany, who is their common enemy. They recognized that Iran was in need of financial support during the war and might need more help afterward. They promised to keep supporting the country, maintaining Iran's independence and integrity. They expected that Iran, alongside other allied nations, would be on board with establishing peace after the war was won, which Iran agreed to when the declarations were made. Now, regarding the military side of things, they decided to send support to the Yugoslav partisans in the form of supplies, equipment, and commando actions. They mentioned that it would be good for Turkey to enter the war on the Allies' side by the end of that year. It was noted that Stalin said if Turkey got into a conflict with Germany and then Bulgaria attacked Turkey, the Soviet Union would go to war with Bulgaria. This information was to be used in discussions to encourage Turkey to join the fight. The leaders planned a significant military push in France, known as Operation Overlord, for May 1944. They also decided on an additional operation in southern France named Operation Dragoon, which would happen as soon as they had enough landing crafts available. At the same time, the Soviet Union would launch its offensive to keep the Germans from moving troops to France. Initially set for June 1st, Operation Overlord was rescheduled to June 5th to align with the necessary moon and tidal conditions. The military staffs from these 3 powers were asked to stay in touch regarding these upcoming operations in Europe and to craft a plan to throw the enemy off the scent. On the political front, Stalin and Churchill discussed Poland's future borders and agreed on the Curzon Line to the east and the Oder-Neisse Line to the west. Roosevelt stayed out of the conversation because he didn't want to influence Polish-American voters or affect the 1944 U.S. election. The agreement on Poland's borders was put on hold and wasn't confirmed until the Potsdam Conference in 1945. During their talks, Roosevelt also managed to ensure that the reincorporation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union would only happen after its citizens had a chance to vote. However, Stalin made it clear that he wouldn't allow any international oversight of these elections. They had to follow the Soviet constitution's rules. During World War II, the Yugoslav partisans received full support from the Allies, while support for the Yugoslav Chetniks was stopped because they were suspected of collaborating with the enemy forces from Italy and Germany instead of fighting against them. The partisans, who were communists led by Josip Broz Tito, eventually took control of Yugoslavia. This happened as German forces began to pull back from the Balkan region between 1944 and 1945. Turkish President İsmet İnönü met with Roosevelt and Churchill at the Cairo Conference in November 1943, and he promised that Turkey would join the war once it was fully armed. By August 1944, Turkey had cut ties with Germany, and come February 1945 they declared war on both Germany and Japan. Although the declaration came quite late in the war, it was a significant move that allowed Turkey to become a part of the United Nations later on. When it comes to Operation Overlord, both Roosevelt and Stalin spent a lot of time convincing Churchill to agree to an invasion of France. They finally succeeded on November 30th. Roosevelt made the announcement that they'd launch the invasion in May 1944 over lunch. This pleased Stalin, who had been pushing for a Western front to help take the pressure off Soviet forces. This operation played a crucial role, as it relieved the Soviet forces and allowed them to push toward Germany, a momentum that Hitler could not reverse. The Tehran Conference also marked a significant moment in the early discussions about creating the United Nations. Roosevelt introduced Stalin to the idea of an international organization that would include all countries and serve as a platform to resolve common issues and guard against aggressors. Given the turmoil brought about by Germany for the second time in just a few decades, all three leaders at the conference, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, agreed that measures needed to be put in place to prevent another global conflict. As for post-war Germany, there was a consensus that the country needed to be divided to prevent future wars. Although the leaders had different views on the number of divisions Germany should be split into, their efforts eventually resulted in the division of Germany into East and West Germany, which lasted until the end of the Cold War. At one point, Churchill asked Stalin about his post-war territorial goals. Stalin's response was that it wasn't the time to discuss Soviet desires, but they would address them when the time was right. Finally, concerning the Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific War, Roosevelt had a series of questions for Stalin on November 29th about intelligence data on Japanese and Siberian ports and the potential use of air bases in the maritime provinces for about 1,000 heavy bombers. By February 2nd, Stalin informed the American ambassador that the United States could operate bombers from the Russian Far East after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. It's important to note that Vladivostok is located in the Russian Far East, not Siberia. Soviet sources reported that German spies had planned to target the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, at the Tehran Conference, but they scrapped their plans before they could take action. The Soviet counterintelligence agency, known as the NKVD, informed Franklin Roosevelt's head of security, Mike Riley, about the potential danger several days before Roosevelt was scheduled to arrive. Riley was in Tehran early to evaluate the security arrangements and the travel plans between Cairo and Tehran. Just before he was set to return to Cairo, the NKVD alerted him that a group of Germans had parachuted into Tehran. They were concerned that these Germans were there to attack the world leaders during their meeting. Roosevelt had received invitations to stay with either Stalin or Churchill during the conference, but he did not wish to show favoritism. He opted to stay separately at the American legation to maintain his neutrality. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran on the 27th of November, 1943. Later that night, Stalin's second-in-command, Vyacheslav Molotov, urgently summoned two ambassadors, Archibald Clark Kerr from Britain and Averell Harriman from the U.S., warning them about threats to the lives of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Molotov revealed that while some suspects had been apprehended, others remained at large, which led him to suggest that Roosevelt move to the British or Soviet embassy for his protection. The Americans were doubtful of Stalin's motives, suspecting he might have fabricated the threat to persuade Roosevelt to stay at the Soviet embassy. Nonetheless, Riley advocated for the president's relocation, deeming it safer and more convenient for all parties involved. Otherwise, it would present a danger for Churchill and Stalin to travel across the city for meetings at the American legation. Agreeing that the risk was unwarranted, the president also noted that staying at the Soviet embassy would facilitate closer work with Stalin. While at the Soviet embassy, the president was heavily protected and situated next to the British embassy, enabling the leaders to meet securely. After the conference concluded, Harriman consulted with Molotov regarding the genuine risk of assassination. Molotov minimized it, suggesting there was no concrete plot, and re-emphasized that Stalin just considered the embassy a more secure location for Roosevelt. Subsequent reports from American and British intelligence, alongside declarations from Otto Skorzeny, the alleged ringleader of the plot, indicated that the assassination threat might have been unfounded, with Adolf Hitler himself deeming the plan unfeasible from the beginning. Nevertheless, the subject persists as a matter of interest among some Russian historians.